All right, so the next talk is by Professor Giovanni Volpe. It's on this very interesting anomalous diffusion challenge. So you may start when you're ready.
Hey, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and I will give this talk, which is a bit different from my usual talk, because I will not only describe the science behind it, but also the challenge, this anomalous diffusion challenge, which we organized last year. And yeah, so what is the anomalous diffusion challenge? So first of all, we have to understand what is diffusion. This is an example of diffusion. So here what you see is a Brownian particle. So you see that it's diffusing. This means that it's jiggling around, and slowly diffusing in its liquid medium. This is a 4-micron particle. The video is a bit accelerated, obviously. And so this is Brownian diffusion. Essentially what was discovered, what takes the name from Robert Brown, who discovered or described this phenomenon in the 1800s, and then of course led to work by Einstein and others in the 20th century. And why diffusion occurs? Well, it occurs because a molecule or a particle immersed in a liquid or in a fluid, it's bombarded by other molecules in the fluid and moves around. So here you see a molecular dynamic simulation of such a particle, which is fully deterministic. But the fact that there are so many degrees of freedom and we can only observe the particle leads to this particle having a trajectory that for all intents and purposes is random. So we cannot really predict it. Of course, again, it's a fully deterministic simulation in this case, but the trajectory really looks a purely diffusive trajectory. So this is how normal diffusion emerges in physical systems. But how we characterize diffusion? Obviously, it's a random process, so we cannot really say much about a single trajectory, but we can say a lot about the average behavior of a group of trajectories. So here we will see now many particles diffusing, normal diffusion, and you see that over time they explore a larger and larger amount of space, indicated by the gray disk underlying the particles. And this can be measured in a very quantitative way in average by using the mean square displacement. So here we will now see the mean square displacement of this group of particles as they spread around. And you see that it's very nicely linear, which is essentially the signature of a normal Einstein diffusion process. By the way, diffusion is incredibly important, and as many of you, I guess, know, Einstein wrote several groundbreaking papers, each one of them worthy of a Nobel Prize in 1905. Amongst them, the Brownian motion paper, which is what eventually convinced the world of the existence of atoms. And some people would argue, for example, Seifert, that was actually the most important paper for which Einstein should have gotten the Nobel Prize. But anyway, that's a different story, obviously. And obviously, that's diffusion, but we can think of anomalous diffusion. What does it mean, anomalous diffusion? Essentially, anomalous diffusion is whatever kind of random process that deviates from this linear mean square displacement. So here you see that you have Brownian normal diffusion for alpha equal 1. And then you can have processes that are super diffusive if the exponent of the mean square displacement is larger than 1. At the limit, that can be directed. Directed means essentially that the particle goes essentially straight. So this is essentially a ballistic particle with exponent 2. On the other hand, you can have subdiffusive processes where the diffusion is hindered, and therefore they're called subdiffusive, which means that the coefficient of the mean square displacement is smaller than 1. So you have alpha smaller than 1, you have subdiffusion. In the limit, you can have an exponent equal 0, which corresponds to a confined particle, like a particle confined in a trap. Typical example, it's an optically trapped particle that will have exactly this mean square displacement, which, by the way, it's interesting to notice can be used for actually calibrating the optical trap. Anyway, why do we have anomalous diffusion? Well, the reason is, there are many reasons. first, it can be crowding. In real life, you don't have a single particle like in the first video I showed you, but you have lots of particles moving around, interacting with each other. So you have an environment which can be quite complex. You have trapping. Maybe you have sites where the particle get permanently or metastably trapped. You can have heterogeneity in the system, interactions between particles, and so on. So basically, the fact that a particle is not diffusive tells us something about the environment surrounding the particle. Typically, subdiffusion means that the particle is somehow confined by its environment or by other particles. Superdiffusion typically indicates that there is some source of energy that is being exploited by the particle, for example, in molecular motors within the cytoplasm. Okay, so where do we find anomalous diffusion? Well, we find it everywhere in all scales. So one can go from atoms in a mot up to, as I already mentioned, molecules in the cytoplasm, which can be either confined, for example, in different cellular compartments, or can be actually propelled by molecular motors. Of course, when we think of cells and bacteria, there is a lot of motion going there. There is the whole field of active matter that basically studies how this motion happens and tries to replicate it in artificial systems. And finally, we can even think of animals or human crowds and study their motion. For example, it's very well generally accepted that in the foraging community that different foraging strategies can have different benefits for different species of animals. For example, often people think of levee flights as a good strategy to look for targets in a homogeneous environment with sparse targets. Also in this field, it's not so easy, obviously, to see what's going on because, you know, many things can change. For example, we showed a few years ago that in an environment with sparse targets, but which has features, so an environment that is not fully homogeneous, then the optimal strategy is not levee flights, but something intermediate between a Brownian motion and a levee flight. So something with the alpha intermediate between one, so not with the alpha of the levee flights. So something that is intermediate between fully superdiffusive and diffusive. Okay, so this tells you that really anomalous diffusion, you will find it everywhere. So it's important to be able to characterize it and be able to decide where it is found. And to give an idea of its importance, there were a Nobel Prize awarded a few years ago for motor molecules, essentially, which are one of the main sources of superdiffusion within microscopic living systems or within living systems on the macroscopic scale. Okay, so typically, how do experiments work? Well, typically experiments work on tracking a particle. Here I'm thinking mostly of microscopic experiments where what typically people do is to essentially acquire a video of microscopic particles moving around, then extract their centroid and characterize their trajectories so that you can have trajectories that you can then study, for example, with a mean square displacement. In this context, there is this very nice review by Carlo Manzo and Maria Garcia Parajo a few years ago in Reports of Progressive Physics, which I mentioned here below. I mean, this is standard, has been around for many years, works very well, but of course the field of particle tracking is not restricted to microscopic particles in the biological field and goes back a long time. So it goes back really to the beginning of the 20th century with experiments which actually convinced the world of the existence of atoms. So you have the Perrin experiments here in 2010, for which Perrin got the Nobel Prize, where basically he manually tracked microscopic particles and could show by tracking them that they were diffusing and could basically demonstrate empirically, experimentally, that Einstein was right. Microscopic particles move, and this permits us to tell something about the existence, first of all, and then the size of the atoms or the molecules constituting the fluid surrounding the particles. Then many more experiments, manual experiments, doing manual tracking ensued, like measuring Brownian torque. And there was a nice shift towards digital microscopy in the 50s, starting in the 50s up to the 90s. And it's very nice. It's a very nice story. You can read it in the review below. But it's very interesting to know that actually the first people to propose the use of digital microscopy or a digital system to track particles will come from a field that you will never imagine, which is essentially coal mining. So basically the problem they had was to be able to automatically track and identify coal particles. And that's why where is the first mention of a digital system to actually measure microparticles. Okay, but this field grew, and until very recently, when deep learning came into play, we developed also our own software suite, which I will not speak too much about, but I obviously encourage you to have a look at. Again, it's in the review below, and this is DeepTrack, which is now in its version 2.1, actually, just came out a few weeks ago. Okay, so we can track the particles and we can have trajectories. Now the question is, from these trajectories, how can we extract the properties of the anomalous diffusion? So the underlying models that produce the anomalous diffusion, which of course cannot be just the Einstein model because that's purely diffusive, and also what is the value of this anomalous diffusion exponent alpha. These are the questions that we would like to answer. And just to emphasize it, anomalous diffusion has really been in the minds of people working with the single particle tracking from the very beginning, because if you go back to the 80s, the first studies mentioning by Saxon, mentioning single particle tracking and so on, they were all mentioning at some point anomalous diffusion. So anomalous diffusion has been really in the mind of people for a very, very long time, and from the inception of the particle tracking field. What changed recently is that now there are tools. In the last few years, several tools have been employed from the field of machine learning in order to measure anomalous diffusion from trajectories. And there was just a few years ago, like in 2019, a wealth of papers that came out. So here you see that there were papers by Metzler, by Yael Reuchmann, by some people in, I cannot pronounce them, some people in Poland, and also our own paper, which came out in 2019, in which, and a paper by Carlo Manzo and Gorka Munoz in 2019, 2020. All these papers, what they have in common is that they independently, curiously, but at the same time, many groups came up with the idea that we should go and look into using machine learning, advanced machine learning techniques such as neural networks. And not only neural networks, by the way. For example, this paper by Carlo Manzo and Gorka Munoz was actually using random forests. So using advanced machine learning tools to characterize anomalous diffusion. And one common thread throughout these papers was that it looked like machine learning could do better than the standard analysis based on the mean square displacement. And that's where the idea came to us to organize a challenge. So, you know, there are lots of open competitions, especially in the field of machine learning applied to different disciplines. And usually you might have heard of Kaggle, for example, or CodaLab. And these platforms organize, help organize in competitions where basically anyone who is interested in a certain topic can compete, sometimes for money, like in Kaggle, or for glory, like in CodaLab, and to see who can do best at a given task. So we decided to organize such a competition. And then obviously the question is, what do we really want people to compete on? So, well, this was also inspired by the fact that there are lots of competition published in journals in the last years. For example, a lot of competition are about particle tracking or microscope, single particle, single molecule localization microscopy, and so on. All these works were published in the last 5-6 years. Okay, so we decided to organize such a competition. The first question, and then we start noticing that it's not so simple as it sounds, because to organize a competition, you have to think of lots of things, starting from the data. which data are you going to use? Then what is the host? What is the community you're going to address? How are you going to evaluate the results? And of course, if you want to publish also, you have to think on the side, how are you going to publish the results? Each step in this chain of tasks that you have to do if you want to organize a competition, obviously it's very complicated in itself, and we discovered that on the way. So, well, the first thing is that we have to think, what do we want to use for data sets? Do we want simulations, real data? If you use the real data, what should we use for ground truth? How can we evaluate contributions on objective ground truth from real data for which we don't really know what is the reality? What dimensions of the anomalous diffusion should we consider? 1, 2, 3, whatever. What conditions should there be noise? All these questions came up. So it's a very complex exercise just to decide what you want to use as basis for your competition. Keeping in mind that this can be arbitrary to some degree, but it needs to be useful also for the community. It cannot be just exercise, sterile exercise. Then you need to decide which hosting. As I said before, there are many platforms that permit you to host competitions. You can use Kaggle, but then you need to have a price in money, which, as you might understand, is not easy to arrange within academia, because usually you cannot just give out money for prizes. You could, luckily, we could use Codalab, which permits to have a competition without having to have a monetary prize. Of course, we also consider other things, how to get a private web. That's also a possibility. But then you have to think about how this is going to be advertised. And of course, you would like to have some kind of automatic scoring system that permits people to know where they stand against their competitors. And of course, you really want that to be automatized, because you don't want to have to score every submission from any participant. Then which community do you want to address? Physics, biology, computer science, and AI. These are really very different communities that have very, very different interests. And you need to decide how you are going to evaluate your contributions to the competition. This means, how are we going to score them, which of course has also an effect on the ranking and on the focus of the competition. Again, here the problem is not just to come up with some numerical format for the scoring, but to come up with a formula that reflects the physics that we want to explore. So we would like to understand which methods are best at something. We need to have a score system that is aligned to that. And finally, you need to publish, which means where you want to publish. You don't really have any guarantee about where you will publish, as you will understand. So what if no one wants to publish your paper? What are you going to tell the contestants afterwards? These are questions that you have in your mind. Okay, so we had to make a lot of decisions. So first decision that we made is to focus on some underlying models for anomalous diffusion. There are many, many possibilities, and these are the ones we chose. So obviously the continuous time random walk, which is one of the fundamental models used very broadly for describing anomalous diffusion. Then we had this variation, in a sense, on the continuous time random walk, which is the annealed transient time motion, which was something that essentially Carlo Manzo, Gorka, Munoz, and Maciej Levenstein came up with a few years before. Then there is fractional Brownian motion, which is very interesting, especially because it taps into the topic of correlations in the motion of a random walker and how this relates to viscoelasticity. And then also scaled Brownian motion, very interesting in itself, where the essential diffusion of a particle varies over time in a deterministic way, and Levy walks, which are very interesting because obviously, as I mentioned before, they are very interesting, especially for the community, foraging community, studying essentially how animals look around for food and mates. Okay, so these were the models we selected. Then we had to decide which tasks we wanted the competition be about. So we chose the following tasks. The first was inference of alpha, which practically means, given a trajectory, maybe a short trajectory, single trajectory of a single particle, tell me what is the alpha. So what is the anomalous exponent of the trajectory? This is a very interesting task in itself. Also because many models are non-ergodic, which practically means that alpha is really defined at an ensemble level, not at single trajectory level. So you see that it's not even obvious that it should be possible with information containing a single trajectory to infer alpha. So this is the first task we decided. The second task we decided to go for was model classification. So to identify which one of the 5 underlying models that we chose, it was the one of a given trajectory. And finally, a more advanced task about trajectory segmentation, which practically means now we have a trajectory which varies, let's say, after a certain amount of time, switches between one kind of motion to another, changing both anomalous diffusion coefficient and model, underlying model of diffusion. So the question here is obviously to identify the change point, but also to identify what are the underlying models for the two phases, as well as the underlying anomalous diffusion coefficients. So these were the 3 tasks we decided to have in our competition. And then we had to think about how to evaluate them. And what we decided to do was to have an evaluation based on the mean absolute error in the case of the inference. So basically, this is a good way of evaluating how much a guess of a participant or the prediction of a participant differs from the ground truth. For the model classification, we use the F1 score, which is a nice way of combining true positive and false negative and false positive together in a way that you have a single number. I mean, in any task where you want to make a scoring system, obviously you have to come up with a single number at the end. That's one of the, I mean, this seems obvious, but you know, there are many alternatives that are also viable. And finally, for the segmentation task, well, we decided to introduce a root mean square error for the change point identification. But then we wanted to also evaluate the identification of the models and the identification of the 2 alpha values. And what we decided to do is to do an inverse ranking. So basically, the final score on this task is given by the inverse average of the ranks that a certain participant obtains for the identification of the change point, of the underlying models, and of the alpha. Okay, so now we have decided a lot of things. We have decided what are the tasks, how we are going to score them. And of course, then we have to decide how many dimensions we want to use. And we decide to go for 3 dimensions. So we will have for each task 3 different dimensions, 1D, 2D, and 3D. So we have in total 9 sub-competitions, if you want. And then the big challenge within the challenge was to actually implement a software that permitted us to simulate. We decided to go for simulated data. The reason is obvious, and it's because we know the ground truth, so we can actually score them. And this was developed by Gorka. And Gorka basically developed a Python toolbox, if you wish, which permits to simulate the different models of diffusion and everything that essentially we needed to create the tasks, and which is completely open source. So also the participant could see how we were creating the data. I could create the data for themselves if they wanted to have more data, for example, for training. Okay, so this at this point we have everything ready for the competition because we know exactly what we want to make people compete about, and yeah, the only thing that we would like to also have is a connection to the experiments. So then we added also a set of experimental data that we gave to the participants of the competition to work on, but they were not scored. So basically we mixed experimental data in the middle of the data that were being scored so that the participant didn't really know what they were. But we didn't score the experimental data, we just scored the numerically simulated ones, but we had information about how well the participant methods were working, also for real data that are experimental. which is not, which is very interesting, obviously, because in these experiments, we'll see these 4 experiments a bit later, but as you see, they're about how molecules, mRNA molecules diffuse within an E. coli, how telomers diffuse within the cell nucleus, how receptors diffuse in a membrane, cellular membrane, and finally about how atoms diffuse in a moth. So these are the 4 experiments we consider. The nice thing in all these cases is that no one really knows what is the underlying model. So, you know, we can, it's actually interesting to find out what these different methods will come up with, as we will see later. Okay, so we have all set up. At this point, let's see the roadmap that we follow for the competition. So this goes back to February 2019 when Carlo Manzo had the first idea. Then he recruited Gorka and Angel Garcia March and Maciej Levenstein from ICFO. And a bit later, we met actually in a nice workshop we organized in Lausanne, which was about active matter and artificial intelligence. And that is where I met actually Gorka and told me about this competition. And at that point, I said, I want to help organizing. It was a very nice and fruitful meeting. And yeah, so I also joined the organization together also with Ralph Metzler. And then it started. And basically for 6 months, we had weekly meetings organizing while mostly Gorka was preparing the software. We were discussing all the things I showed you before until we managed to kick off the phase 1 of the competition on March 1st, 2020. We were lucky in the unlucky circumstances of the COVID, because that's when COVID started worldwide, which means that lots of people were stuck inside their house. So lots of people actually participated. They would not have participated otherwise. You know, there is a silver lining to everything. And so we went to a phase 1, then phase 2, more restricted of the competition in September. Phase 3 started at the end of October. And finally, we ended the competition on the 1st of November. After that, we announced the winners on the 9th of November, 2020. And then, as you see, this takes 1 year in which we wrote and came up with a wrap-up paper. That was an excruciating process, as you can imagine, because we had to condense all the materials all the participants had produced into something that could be in the format and size of a paper. And in parallel to this, we organized a workshop where basically all participants and winners could come and exchange opinions. We were very lucky to be able to do it in person in Barcelona, the ICFO facilities in Castelldefels, in December 1st to 3rd, 2021, basically between the Delta and the Omicron variants. And we also had, all in parallel to all these challenges, a special issue in which we collected the contributions of the participants and their insights in a more extensive form, which is in Journal of Physics A, and it's basically now closing. It's not possible to have more submissions, but there are a few submissions still pending. But the special issue is already online and you can obviously read it. Okay, so how many participants did we get? We got, as I said, we were in a sense lucky because many people were stuck at home. So we had lots of participants with 30 participants in 16 teams from 14 different institutions in 10 different countries, which is a lot for a challenge which is their first edition. Here, I don't expect you to read this, but here you see the team name, the affiliations, and the method that they employed. You don't really need to read it, but just to give you an impression of the wide participation we had. Now, let's see the results. So this is task 1. I'm not going too much into the details. You see that we have results. These letters correspond to the various teams. And here we have 1D, 2D, and 3D. Let's focus on the 1D case. The results are qualitatively similar for the 3 cases. This is about inferring the anomalous diffusion exponents. And you see that obviously in this case, we use the mean absolute error to decide how good is a certain result. Therefore, the smaller this bar, the better the result. And you see that what is important to see, the conclusion we get here is that all the top methods are essentially based on neural networks. So all of these are different flavors of neural networks. And then we have some more statistical methods, let's say classical deterministic statistics like Bayesian inference, scaling analysis, which scored clearly worse, but still decent. And just to give you an idea, this is kind of a baseline, because this is what you get if you use to make the inference the time average mean square displacement. So you need to do at least better than this, because otherwise you can just do a mean square displacement. And you see that, for example, Bayesian inference does a bit better, having the big advantage of being completely analytical. So really transparent. Okay, what can we see about these results? Well, first of all, we can see that this is the ground truth value for the anomalous exponent. This is what we get for the predicted exponent, and you see that the best method does pretty well. And by the way, this is what you get with the mean square displacement, and you see that you get that in many cases you really miss it, which means that an anomalous exponent different from 1 gets classified as 1. Why? Well, because of what I was saying before. A lot of the underlying models are non-ergodic, which means that the mean square displacement for the single trajectory looks like having a slope of 1, while you really see the slope different from 1 only when you have an ensemble average of multiple trajectories. So it's really expected that the mean square displacement will give you a lot of false ones for super diffusion and subdiffusion. Anyway, then we can also explore how different models performed. And here you can see that mean absolute error for different models is very different. So you see that there are models that are easier somehow to interpret for the algorithms than others. And what is particularly clear is that the ATTM, so the annealed transient time motion, is one of the most difficult to classify. And the reason is, it's understandable. The reason is because, sure, you can ask a question, Luca, just unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. No, it might be a stupid question because I'm following from the phone, so I cannot really have a very good visual slide. I was curious about the inference. Are you able to extrapolate also, or to infer only values that have been used in the training?
Extrapolate means what in this case?
Okay, so you never extrapolate. You only infer things that have already been known. Let's say.
I mean, obviously, suppose
you train only on a range of alpha exponents.
Okay. If you can extrapolate outside the range.
If you show something that has an alpha that is larger or smaller than what you've shown.
This was not tried because we gave. I mean, in this challenge, we gave the full range for training and for testing. So we didn't really try that. My guess is that if you try to do that and you train on a restricted range of alpha, then the network will be able to recognize that something that, let's say you train between 0.5 and 1.5, and you give then some trajectory that is 1.8, it will probably classify as 1.5 or something larger. I guess. But that's just my guess.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
But no, sure. Any question is welcome. Okay, but here what I was saying is that essentially some models are easier to classify than others. One that is very easy to classify, for example, looks like is these Levy walks, which is understandable because they go straight for a long time. And so then so the best is for the fractional Brownian motion, which is again even for the an ergodic kind of motion, therefore it's easier for classify even for the mean square displacement. But even in this case, you see that the other methods based on machine learning actually outperform the mean square displacement significantly. And then what can we see? We can also see that depending on the trajectory length, we get better results the longer the trajectory, which is obviously fully expected. What is nice to see here is that also the mean square displacement, time average mean square displacement saturates. Again, the reason for this is that the mean average mean square displacement doesn't deal well at all with non-ergodic processes. And then we can also see a dependence on the noise. And of course, the more noise you have, the worse results you get, which is not surprising, but it's nice to verify. Second task was classification of the underlying diffusion model. Here we use the F1 score, which practically means that you want to get a higher score, more towards 1. That's a better result. And again, we focus on the 1D case. And again, what we see is that the machine learning methods based on neural networks outperform clearly the statistical analysis method that competed, so Bayesian and scaling analysis, which is a nice, interesting conclusion in itself. So if we look at the F1 score as a function of alpha, we see that there are, well, we see that basically all methods have this like camel-like behavior, where they have 2 minima around 0 and 1, which is again not too surprising. At 0, basically all this motion converge towards something that is essentially a particle that is not moving. So obviously, you know, something is not moving, can be any of this. And at 1, it's also the case that a lot of this model converge towards a normal Brownian motion. They are mathematically undistinguishable from a Brownian motion. Therefore, you would expect them to basically not be able to classify it. So these 2 dips are really expected, and it's nice to see them in the data. What else? We can then again classify as a function of length. No surprise here. We see that the longer the trajectory, the better we can classify it. And also we see that the lower the noise, the better we can classify it. So when the signal to noise ratio increases, we get a better classification. And finally, we see also in this case that we have, let's say, troubles with the ATTM, annealed transient time motion, and SBM, scale Brownian motion. Again, for the same reasons as before, probably because these 2 models are somehow, the annealed transient time motion can converge in some limit to something that is really undistinguishable from a Brownian motion, and same thing for scaled Brownian motion. Then the third task, the segmentation task. Well, in this case, we have the segmentation. So we want to segment a trajectory and find the change point, as you might remember, as well as the values of alpha for the 2 segments and the underlying model for the 2 segments. And well, the change point classification looks like, okay, here I have to say one thing, only 3 teams participated. So we had a very much lower adoption than in the other cases. In the other cases, we have lots of teams, so we have really strong conclusion. In this case, we have very few teams, so our conclusions are on less solid ground, obviously, but we can say something. And one is that, well, the change point is identified better. This is the root mean square displacement. No, the root mean square error of the change point as a function of where along the trajectory the change point is found. And of course, if the change point is more in the middle, it's easier to identify for the algorithms, which makes sense. And even more nice, much nicer than that, is that when we make a random prediction, which is a kind of baseline, where basically you just guess randomly what the change point should be, you will get this kind of behavior here. So we do much better than random. All machine learning methods here, they're all machine learning methods, first of all, and they all do much better than random. And then we can also look at the confusion matrix for the alpha in the first and second element segments, as well as the model in the first and second segments. And finally, we see some asymmetries here. There are many questions that are still open here. And we will see that this is one of the reasons why we want to continue exploring this, possibly in a second challenge. Okay, so these are the tasks and the results. But to let you, in case you are interested, explore them on your own and look at this. As I said before, it was really a grueling work to find out, to decide what to include in the paper. So what we decided to do is to also give anyone the ability to play with the results we have, of the results that all competitors had. So we created this interactive tool, which you can find in andychallenge.org interactive tool, which essentially it's an applet where you can play with all the tasks and data submitted by the participants in the Andy challenge. And you can, for example, well, you see, this is how it looks like. You have different tasks. Then you can select task 1, for example, and here you can select, for example, the dimension of the trajectory you want to analyze, the team you want to see, the length of the trajectory, the noise level, and you can see for different conditions which teams perform best, how they performed, and so on. You can do this for task 1, task 2, and task 3, obviously. And even more interestingly, you can input your own data and compare your performance to the one of the other of the teams on the same data set that we used for evaluating the challenge, which of course gives you a possibility to benchmark new approaches against what you have done in the challenge. So we have plenty of possibilities. Okay, and then finally, we can also go back to the experimental data we had, which, as I said before, they were given to the participants in a kind of a sneaky way, dispersed among the evaluation data. We didn't use them for evaluation, obviously, but in this way, we got what they thought they were the results for the experimental data. And these were from 4 experiments. One experiment was this one, mRNA molecules diffusing in the cytoplasm of an E. coli. And here, the original paper claimed an alpha between 0.7 and 0.77 and was undecided between continuous time random walk and fractional Brownian motion. So we ran all the top methods, not all the methods. And nicely, they actually find the kind of the right value for alpha, which is the dashed line here. And but notice here that if you use the time average mean square displacement, you will get this gray histogram, which is off the actual value claimed by the authors, which is a nice result in itself. And then we classified also. And here you can see that the classification tends to go towards ATTM, which of course is not what the authors were originally claiming, because they were claiming continuous time random walk. But to be fair, the authors didn't know that ATTM was actually proposed after this paper, so it could not be included amongst the options for their paper. But it's interesting to see that we also find some disagreement, but the disagreement is very consistent among all the methods developed by different teams, which makes it very reliable. In a sense, they are seeing something here that probably has some truth. The second data set that we explored was telomeres in the cell nucleus. Again, in the original paper was an alpha equal 0.5 for short time that then tended to 1, so was subdiffusive tending towards diffusive, and they identified this as fractional Brownian motion. So in this case, you see that we have the 2 levels, 0, 5, and 1 are indicated by the dashed lines. And you see that all the methods actually tend to be in that range, which is, again, comforting. And then here we see that, in fact, all methods tend to classify this motion as a fractional Brownian motion, which is what the original authors of the papers were expecting. Another experimental data set was receptors in the plasma membrane. And in this case, we expected alpha equal 0.84, and we expected this to be ATTM. This is, I think, the paper where originally Carlo Manzo proposed ATTM. And well, first of all, we see that we get a very good agreement. In this case, even the time average mean square displacement gives the very good agreement. And in fact, most methods classify it as ATTM with somehow also some prevalence of scale Brownian motion. Finally, we have this atoms in periodic potential dataset. I have to say that this dataset was particularly challenged to classify because the trajectory were extremely short, like 10 data points. So it's very, very challenging dataset. And what the original paper claimed or said was that alpha was equal 1, and this was essentially a Brownian motion. And here you see that even though with a very large distribution, the method tends to classify this as a kind of Brownian motion. And very nicely, they indeed classify this as a continuous time random walk amongst all the methods. It's much more noisy, again, mainly because these trajectories are extremely short. So it's expected to have more noise. Okay, so we can conclude we can draw some general conclusion from this handy challenge. On the inference of alpha task, we see that most, well, first of all, the first conclusion is that machine learning greatly improves precision, and that machine learning algorithms developed by different groups. This applies also to the classification, actually. So machine learning works better than classical methods. And what reinforces our belief that this is actually true is that methods completely independently developed by different groups lead to the same results on experimental data sets for which we don't really know the ground truth, and the underlying model probably is not exactly what would be a mathematical CT continuous time random walk, for example. There is no reason why it should be mathematically exact. But different independently developed methods tend to agree, which is very nice. On the segmentation task, you know, this was not very subscribed by competitors. So we had very few competitors that tried it, like 3, which means that our conclusions are a bit less general. But we can say something also in this case. We can say that all competitors that participated managed to do much better than chance, which means that there is a lot of potential there. And then we observe also that there is some asymmetry between the 2 segments, first and second, in how they are classified, which is an interesting thing to explore in the future, which might depend, might be as simple as that it depends on the inaccuracy in the change point determination, but it might be also that these processes, non-ergodic processes in particular, tend to be non-stationary. We'll see. And finally, the very nice result is that we can also use this method to analyze experimental data. And on this experimental data, different methods independently trained and not specifically trained for this method actually tend to agree, and also agree with mostly agree with the results from the original papers. Okay, so if you are interested in this, obviously we had the paper about the challenge, which was published last November. And here it gives me also the opportunity to highlight the people that actually organized the challenge. As I said before, the idea came from Carlo Manzo and Gorka Munoz, at the time a PhD student, now a postdoc in Austria, was really the driving force and really the typing force. He wrote the programs and so on. But then there was also Miguel Angel Garcia Mart and Maciej Levenstein from ICFO and Ralph Metzler from Potsdam, and of course myself. So we were the organizer of this challenge. And as I said before, there is this nice special issue that we are closing now in the next few months. And we have lots of contributions that are already published. So I really invite you to go there and look at them if you want to know essentially everything about anomalous diffusion and how it can be estimated from trajectories. You do find it in the special issue. Most of the competitors, especially the top competitors, publish their methods in very great detail in this special issue. And finally, I must say that we are now organizing a second challenge, which probably will be online in the summer 22, so in a few months. This is a follow-up challenge in which we explore different aspects. This time we will explore trajectories and videos, so it's much more, in a sense, related to what biologists are really interested in, which means to be able to actually analyze their data. So we will have two tracks, one about analyzing trajectories and the other about analyzing videos. All of this obviously simulated so that we know the ground truth. And then to be able to classify and understand the motion of the particles in this context. Again, it will open, I guess, in the summer, and it will be obviously open to everyone. And if any of you is interested, it will be very good if you participate. As last time, the idea is that we will end up publishing this, having a workshop about it, and having a special issue. So let's put it like this, it's not wasted time. It goes straight into your CV. And finally, I just want to acknowledge my group, my funding sources. And this was the last picture we took pre-pandemic. And with that, I thank you.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting talk. I think we have enough time for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand in the, yeah. I had a question maybe in the meanwhile. So this is maybe more to do with characterizing the trajectories, as you said. I don't know if it's more for the future or so, but how would you define the ground truth for something like segments in trajectories? That's, I think, not very clearly defined, right?
You mean for simulated trajectories, or
yes, for even for simulated trajectories?
Well, we simulate them, so we know the ground truth. So practically, so let's just go back to the task. So like in this case, in practice, this trajectory is built by simulating this one, and then stitching them together.
Right. But what I mean is, if I have a trajectory from, let's say, some other simulation, like in a turbulent simulation or so, and I have particle trajectories, then it's that I guess would fall under an experimental category then, I suppose, because it's not very...
Yes, that would be a numerical experiment from our point of view, because we don't have directly the ground truth, but yeah, that would be a numerical experiment.
Right.
And by the way, that's something I can give you another example, because in this paper that we published before the challenge, in which we proposed, we were one of the ones proposing the use of neural networks for just a second. So in this paper here, in which we proposed the use of recurrent neural network to classify trajectory, we did also a segmentation task, and we applied it to experimental data. In that case, we managed to have a clear change point, because we managed, basically what we did was to use active particles that is activated by light. So we had a Brownian particle, then we switch on the light and the particle starts becoming active. So it becomes obviously super diffusive. And then we know that, well, we don't know the value of the super diffusion exponent, but we know the time at which it happens. And we know that it must be larger than 1.
Right.
So yeah, you can do that if you have full control of the experiment, even in that case. But for the challenge, we decided that was not a good thing to, a good way to go, because, you know, we cannot really guarantee the values and so on.
Yeah. There's a question from Rachel. Please go on and ask your question.
Thank you for a really interesting talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering, in the context of say swimming microorganisms, we sometimes talk about diffusion, maybe not so much anomalous diffusion, but regular diffusion. So we could think of microswimmers that say do have normal diffusion. The MSD is linear, but there are situations where it's important to understand what's generating that diffusion, whether it's a correlated random walk, whether it's runs and tumbles. And I was wondering whether you could comment on the methodologies of identifying, model identification. Could that be applied to perhaps some of these simpler situations where it's not anomalous diffusion, but we still want to know what's generating that diffusion?
Yes, I'm just going to the task in which we did that. I mean, you can use this, and yeah, you can use the same insight and algorithms that were developed here, what you will have to do essentially, this is a very good question in the sense that it leads to many follow-up questions that I can try to explain briefly. So the simplest thing you can do is that you have your swimming microorganisms, you have the trajectories, you want to classify them in an objective way. You can use a neural network models like these ones, for example, trained on the underlying models that you can expect. So you have to retrain them and then see which one the neural network will select. This will permit you to classify. The follow-up problem could be that none of the models that you have at the end are actually correct. And then it becomes very interesting because, you know, it's not so easy to have a null model. Like you can try to have a null model, which is kind of a default where the neural network should fall when it cannot really classify any of the models. Another thing you can do is to use multiple approaches here. And since you train them, since they have different architecture and different trainings, they will not agree when the model. So if one of the models that you have in the training set is the correct one, they should all agree. But if it's not any of the models, then they should just give each one a different model because there is no real reason why they should all go towards one model. So you can basically do an ensemble of neural networks and methods and take this ensemble information with the entropy that they produce as an indicator whether your model is actually within the training set. So you can do that.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? So I want to quickly ask as well that, so are these algorithms or so on, they are available online? You mentioned somewhere?
Everything is available. If
so
you
that we can
essentially,
use it on,
you can use almost everything, I would say. We didn't force the participants to make them available online, but I think your first point of entry can be the article we wrote, this one.
Yeah.
In this article, in the supplementary, we have the list of all algorithms with a brief description and with information about where you can find them. And all of them, the ones that are available, are linked from the GitHub page of the Andy Challenge 1. So yeah, you can find almost everything online. And we were very happy that most, here you don't see the authors because there was no simple way to take a screenshot with the authors, but most of the participants in the Andy Challenge actually ended up publishing the detailed information about their methods in a separate paper within the special issue. So you really have a wealth of information there.
That's excellent. Thank you. So if there are no more questions, let's thank Professor Giovanni again for this talk.
Thank you.